Hi there, Joshua Hanlon here, and today we're at the Historic Ships in Baltimore, and I'm joined by Brian, and behind us is a World War II submarine here at the Historic Ships. So, do you want to tell us a little bit about the history of this and how this got here to Baltimore?
Yeah, so she came to Baltimore in 1972, and USS Torsk is a submarine that sank the last two enemy warships during World War II. So the two final kills got by the US Navy were from this vessel in the Sea of Japan in 1945. She's a Tench class submarine, a fleet type submarine, meaning she is run on diesel electric propulsion, and kind of represents the tail end of the fleet boat era before they switched the submarine fleet over to nuclear power. So she's kind of represents what we had figured out and designed in terms of submarine technology up until basically the major advance of nuclear power, which we can talk about when we go inside. She had a crew of 80 men to operate on her, and was primarily a surface vessel. So if you take a look at the bow here, comparing this bow to that of a modern submarine, which has the teardrop hull design where it's like a rounded hydrodynamic design, this one much more reflects the bow of a surface vessel because this submarine is primarily a surface vessel. It can do one thing that surface vessels can't do, which is obviously submerge. But primarily she'll be operating on the surface, and so she's designed in that way with the little extra trick of being able to go underwater and come back up. So when we go on board, we can see all the designs that went into trying to make this thing possible. But the main goal that we're going for in submarine design here is to make this thing be able to hide. The whole purpose of being able to submerge is to be able to hide. That's your advantage, to be able to go invisible, stealth, if you will. And so everything about how it's built, painted, and designed is designed to make it have as small and low a profile as possible so that it can hide. If you look up top and come slightly over here to the side, you'll see there are two periscopes up on the sail there. The attack periscope is the tall, skinny one, and it's like that because the tall, thin little viewer that sticks out of the surface of the water has a very small profile and it's hard to see up close. Versus the observation periscope, which is much bigger, that's the more forward one with the camouflage painted on it. That one has the camouflage painted on it because when it sticks out of the water, it's much more conspicuous, so they try to help it blend in by trying to paint it. But that's just an example of how the submarine is designed to be able to hide, because we have all ships can have speed, armor, and firepower are their sort of main triad of capabilities, and we have no armor and our speed is terrible. So the only thing we really have is firepower, which with a torpedo I can sink an entire ship. So I have just awesome firepower, but no speed and no armor. So once we're spotted and we're sighted, we are pretty much no match for any other vessel. So the main little trick we keep up our sleeve is that ability to hide. So even being painted gray like this helps us to blend in when you're out at sea. Low to the surface like this, the ocean is grayish blue and the sky is bluish gray. So we paint this boat to be that color to help it blend in. And when we go up on the top, you'll see it would be painted black so that it blends in with the abyss. So when you're looking down, an airplane can't see it. So we're going to see much more of that evident when we get inside and see how small and tight everything is so that we have a nice low profile. That's the main thing to take away from the design here of the sub, is being able to have as low a profile as possible, but as I said from Constellation, it is a Navy vessel, which means there is some tradition that goes into its design that you could argue defeats the purpose of being able to hide, or at least goes against that philosophy. So we'll take a look at that when we go inside. All right, so we're up here, up on the main deck, the weather deck, if you will, on the sub. And what I just mentioned about the naval tradition, one thing that's tradition in the Navy is for all of our ships to have wooden decks. Constellation over there is made out of wood, just like ships were for hundreds of years. And so that tradition carries over into modern warships. I don't know if they still do it actually on modern boats that are coming out today in ships, but up through the 20th century, all the big steel-hulled warships all had wood decks put on the surface. That's mostly for tradition. It also provides some good insulation against the sun beating down on a big tin can. And so the submarine, like any other ship in the Navy, has a wooden deck as part of the tradition. The difference between ours and others is that our deck has gaps in it, and that's because this thing that we're standing on here, this platform, is essentially just a scaffold built on top of the pressure hull for the crew to come up here and have a place to stand and work comfortably while we're mere feet from the sea. And so this provides us a nice platform to work on. However, there's no pressurization underneath of here. It's just the deck. And so if we submerge too deep and atmospheric air gets trapped in here because the deck is sealed, then it'll get crushed like a soda can from the pressure. So having the gaps here lets water leak in, fill up that void under there, and the pressure becomes equalized so this doesn't collapse when we submerge. So it's a submarine, you gotta be thinking about stuff like that. So otherwise, wooden deck is very traditional and very normal to find on board a ship. The only difference here is that this one would be painted black, because if you compare this to the deep, this is white. And so an airplane flying over looking for enemy submarines would see us immediately. And so we would paint it black to help us hide. However, as a museum today, if I paint it black, then next year I'm going to paint it black again and again and again. So to avoid a lot of extra work that we don't really need anymore, we just keep it nice and wood colored like this. So it's Ipe, it's got a 40-year lifespan, so it should be in pretty good shape for a long period of time, provided we don't try to do anything cosmetic like paint it. So we'll just leave it unpainted. And then also, just another interesting thing to think about here is, on board ship, a ship is like a home or a city away from civilization. So everything we would need as a small society we have to have on board, including food, division of labor, special skills, people to take care of us, and then stuff to take care of us in case we have an emergency. So like redundant power supplies, so we don't just have one source of power that can be taken out. Another thing we have to think about is if we get stranded at sea, how are we going to communicate? We have various ways to signal. We have radios. We have simple flags. You can't disable a flag like this. This is as simple as it gets. So we always have a way to try to save ourselves, and it goes from more technical to least technical. Well, one of the things I'm standing on here is an example of that. This is my messenger buoy. So if the ship were to be sunk or distressed in shallow water and sitting on the bottom, we have this messenger buoy which we could release, and in it it's essentially a big orange bubble with a telephone in it. And so when we release this from the bottom, we have several hundred feet of wire that can spool out. This could go to the surface, and this passing ship would come by and see a buoy that's in a place where there shouldn't be a buoy. Like, what is this? And they see there's a phone and pick up, like, hello? And oh my God, finally, you're there. So we're stuck down here. Can you send somebody? So that's kind of how that works. So we have this just in case. However, most of the ocean is deeper than this will go. So this mostly is here so that your mom feels better about you serving on a sub. But historically, there's really not too many instances where something like this saved anybody, because it only works in shallow water.
Right.
So we're going to head down into the sub. We're going to be heading through the aft torpedo loading hatch. The actual cruise entrance is actually forward of us. It's a hatch that goes straight in down a ladder. But for our visitors today, we want to make sure we're accessible to as many people as possible. So we just have a little stairwell to go down. Through the hatch, we would load torpedoes through.
What types of preservation work is ongoing? I know you mentioned things like painting the deck and the added labor that would bring, but what types of preservation work is kind of regularly ongoing here, since this is in the water still?
Sure. So the steel hull ships have a problem that is the opposite of Constellation. So USS Constellation is our wooden warship. That one is very well preserved below the waterline, and it gets damaged and slowly gets destroyed from freshwater rain. This one's the exact opposite. Rain doesn't really bother it too much. It causes some rust, which we can then just needle gun off. Where this ship is most vulnerable is below the waterline. Salt, and Chesapeake Bay here is brackish water, so it's like half salt, half fresh. The salt water slowly will corrode the steel. And water in general will slowly cause steel to oxidize, and it will turn into rust particles instead of solid metal. They were just talking about this with the Titanic last year when that sub sank. Slowly, the Titanic is going to turn into just a pile of rust. Like 200, 300 years from now, it's just going to be a rust pile on the bottom. So one of the ways we can combat that is what we call cathodic protection, where they use zinc anodes. They look like gold bullion, except they're zinc. And they have little electrodes sticking out of the end of each one, and they have a line of them in certain sections of the hull, and they essentially run a low voltage current through the hull, and it goes through these zinc anodes and causes like reverse electrolysis through the water. So the water, the chemical reactions that occur to erode the steel wind up instead eroding the zinc anodes, and they keep the steel intact. So it kind of protects the steel from corrosion, and so it's like these sacrificial anodes that we replace every 5-10 years or so. And when you pull them out, you can see what used to be a big bullion is now just a thin little strip of metal, and they just change it out for a new one. And that'll keep the hull in fairly decent shape and keep it from corroding as an overall rule. There are weak points and there are strong points. The particular weaknesses are at the water lines where waves wash up on it, so sometimes it's wet and then it dries out, and then sometimes it's wet and then dries out. That's where it really can corrode. So our water line is kind of the weakest point. So that's where we watch it the most. And then on board a ship like this, a lot of the interior preservation work is either repairing things that have been broken over time, or like in this case, when this ship was decommissioned, she sat for a while before it became a museum, and so other subs that needed things would come on and strip it. So by the time it came to Baltimore in 1972, they had sort of a hollowed out shell. And so over the past 40 years or so, volunteers and the museum have been putting it back together, going and doing that exact thing, stripping other ships of their stuff and putting it on ours to sort of put it back to where it would be an approximation of what it should look like. And then we also do other things, like for example, we have the original, some of the electronic systems have like the old tube electronics. And so we can operate parts of the ship, but when a tube blows, I can't replace it anymore. They don't make tubes anymore. So our volunteers do some things where they change out electrical devices for modern, like transistor things, but then we have to put the facades back on so it looks right. And with LED lighting, we're changing out. We have these old fluorescent fixtures. We're changing out for LEDs slowly, kind of one at a time. When it's raining outside, we can't do anything out here. We go in there and change out a few lights. And so it's not so much as preserving it inside. There is some of that, but it's modernizing it and making it efficient now so we can operate it in the long run and keep it as cost effective as possible to do. So preservation outside is mostly paint. Like it actually needs some paint. We're working on raising some money right now to do a repaint of it. So we do that every couple of years, and then keeping things oiled, polished inside, and as things corrode, we repair them. But like again, it's mostly should just ideally would just be a stabilization thing where we get it to a point where it's totally restored to what it should look like, and then we just maintain it. And so it's just kind of keeping things up. And occasionally, I'm rambling, but it kind of occasionally requires some specialty advice. Like luckily in Baltimore here, we're surrounded by a port, so we have shipbuilders and ship repair companies all over the place that can come in and give them advice on how to repair a certain problem or whatever. Like for example, here we use the heads on board, but we're not hooked up to sewage. So like how do we pump out the holding tanks? Well, we had a ship guy come and help us out. We actually just used a sewage pump, like for a septic system.
Yeah.
He just drove his truck out here on the pier and pumped it out. So like, stuff like that we have to sort of maintain and figure out. But for the most part, it's mostly just keeping it stable and then ideally restoring things as we learn new things about how things would have been, or we get something back. Crew have been known to take things when they leave. They like pull a knob off of somewhere as a souvenir, and then all of a sudden 40 years later we get a donation like, hey, my husband died and he had this thing from the ship, and we got the helm from our Coast Guard cutter back that way. It was in his bar, in his basement behind his bar. Like, wife wanted to clear it out. She was like, you want this back? Like, yeah, I'll take the helm. Like, so yeah, we get stuff back, we put back every once in a while, and yeah, so that's kind of how we do it. Just kind of spot checking things as it goes.
Sounds good. Well, we'll take a look inside then.
Let's head in.
Attention. To ensure your safety, please turn and face all ladders. Adults should go to...
Okay, so we're now in the aft torpedo room on board USS Torsk. We're in the very back end of the ship, which is right there. Beyond that, there's nothing, just open sea. And so people walk in here and they're often surprised to see at the back of the submarine torpedo tubes. Most people think of them being at the front, but we do have them in the back just because of the way the submarine had to operate tactically. From this room was sunk the last two enemy ships during World War II in the Sea of Japan. This tube here with the torpedo sticking out of it, that's tube number 7. That fired a Mark 27 acoustic homing torpedo, like the one I'm putting my hand on. And it sank a Japanese Makura-class coastal defense frigate in the Sea of Japan. On August 14th, 1945, the ceasefire came on the 15th. So the next day is when the ceasefire was agreed to, and then the formal treaty was signed in early September of that year. So this was the last kill, right from this room where I'm standing. Now the torpedoes back here are in the back because, as I mentioned earlier, the sub relies on its ability to hide in order to maintain its survivability. And so just like any other position or any other job in the Army, when you're shooting, you give away your position. And so when we fire a torpedo, no matter how well hidden we are, our position is given away because a number of things. First of all, sonar can detect torpedoes coming and then can direction find and figure out where they came from. But it's easier than that. At the back of the torpedo, you have one of the biggest weaknesses of submarine technology, which is this propeller. We have propellers on the back of the sub to propel us, and they might as well just be screaming, "Here we are," because they spin like this, and when they spin, this propeller blade here is taking up space in the sense of like physics. There's space here, and when this spins, right here where there was water, it takes a measurable amount of time for water to fill in that space, and in the intervening microsecond, inside here is the same vacuum that there is on the surface of the moon. And so what happens is the water boils away, and so you get bubbles, even though there's no oxygen immediately present. It's called cavitation. The propeller makes a cavity, and the water temporarily boils and then closes, and then bubbles fly up. So when we fire our torpedo, the propeller is creating a bubble trail behind it, which is drawing a line right to where we are. So all I have to do is look down in the water and follow the line of bubbles, and you'll come right to us. So that is a major weakness. So once we fire a torpedo, our position is given up. So the submarine is long, thin, and slow. And so what happens is if I fire a spread of torpedoes out the forward end, there's a convoy of ships there. I might knock out 1 or 2 ships, but all the rest of the convoys see the bubble trail, and they're going to come following the bubbles. And now I have to get away, so I have to get my very slow engines and bring this long, skinny boat all the way around like this. I've still gone nowhere, but here they come. And now I can finally kind of get going up to about 9 knots, which it's about 10 miles an hour, so most of you can run faster than this boat can go. So, and here we go, and they're on us, and now they'll stay on us until we run out of gas or they kill us. So rather than trying that, we just won't even bother. What we'll do is we'll hide. We'll go down underwater. Here comes the convoy. They go on by, and then we sneak nice and quietly underneath, and then we come up the other side, throw the engines full speed, so we take off, and then as we're running away, we fire out the rear, and by the time they look down and see the bubble trail, we're gone. So that's the idea. So that's why we have this in the back here, so we can do that maneuver if we need to. We still have more torpedo tubes up forward than we do back here, but there may be situations where this will be a much better place to fire from, particularly when we're alone. If we have no protection around us, we're going to want to try to get away as much as possible. Each of the submarines that you visit in the United States have a plaque like this. The American submarine force had one of the highest casualty rates of any force during World War II. 1 out of 4 submarine crew members did not return. In the German U-boat Navy, it was 3 out of 4, so it was like a bloodbath for them. But for us, it was still very high. It was 25%. It was about 10% in the Army. So we had much higher casualty rates. And a submarine, when it is lost at sea, it is said to still be on patrol. So this is a list of all of our submarines that are still on patrol that were sunk during the war. And every submarine museum in the country has this plaque. So we have ours here on display. And then that's pretty much it for the torpedo room. The only other thing I'd like to point out is just something to start getting used to on board the sub. Right up here, you can see it's very small in here. And so every available space that there is, we will use it somehow. And so in this case, we have torpedoes stacked on sleds here. We actually have torpedoes on this side too. We've just removed them so our visitors can get through. There'd be torpedoes stacked on both sides, but above the torpedoes, there's a small void between there and the outer hull. And so we fill it with something, and in this case, we fill it with people. We have bunks up here. There'd be enough bunks in here, stacked up here, and then also right out here in the middle, because remember, this is just for torpedo loading. This is not egress, so this wouldn't be here. So there'd be bunks down here too. So 12 to 18 people could berth in here at any time. And just because you're berthed in here does not mean that you're a torpedo man. You might just be the cook, and you happen to be sleeping in here, so when people are in here working, you're trying to sleep right next to them. So it's just part of the life on a submarine. Is, again, everything about this boat is built to have as small a profile as possible. So when it comes to your comfort or hiding, we're going to pick hiding.
And you talked a little bit earlier about some of the propulsion for these torpedoes, but at this point in the war, at the very end, you're to August 1945, when those final vessels were sank. How far had technology come with the torpedoes? Had those changed a lot during the war? Or did that kind of stay the same? How had that evolved?
It changed a little bit. The basic concept is the same. The main factors in this torpedo are its propulsion system and the detonation system. So all the torpedoes generally have a plastic explosive warhead. In this case, Torpex or HBX was the chemical used as the actual explosive in the front. And then what sets it off and what powers it is kind of what differentiates them. And you notice here we have a Mark 27. On the bottom is a Mark 14. So the Mark 14 was considered a very reliable torpedo. That was from World War II all the way up, I think, into the 70s. They used this. It's powered with a little steam-powered motor, and the steam is produced with a fuel. It's 200 proof ethanol. So Everclear is what powers this torpedo, literally. And so that was considered very reliable. The Mark 27, if you look in here, you can see it was actually battery powered, so it's electrically driven. Also has its benefits and drawbacks. The main benefit is it can be much smaller. You don't have to have a giant water tank and a giant fuel tank and a whole system to ignite it and make the steam and all that. This is much more simple. But electronics, the more complex they get, the more problems they have. So we had other torpedoes. We like to joke here at the museum sometimes and say that there's not a single American torpedo that hasn't killed Americans, because like the Mark 37 had acoustic homing head on it. And when they were testing it, a couple times it would turn around and come back towards the firing submarine if there was no other target. They had to like work that out. So they all had problems when they first got put into service, but they perfect them and learn over time. So yeah, this one has a magnetic detonation. So when it gets close to something metal to draw the magnet, essentially the magnet gets pulled, and that's what sets off the explosive. Some of them can be done with timers. It just depends. And the important thing to remember about torpedoes is they're not bullets. So like I mentioned earlier, they travel with propellers, so they're slow. They go about 60 miles an hour, which is fast on the highway, but it's not fast compared to a bullet. So if your target is 10,000 yards downrange and it's moving at 20 knots, that means you can't fire like at the target. You gotta like do trigonometry and figure out where it's gonna be, provided they don't hear it coming and change course. And so that's what the benefit of like a magnetic detonator is it won't go off until it gets near something. Whereas the Mark 14, you would have a timer, or they did put magnets in these too, but if it goes off in 5 minutes, then you just hope that the ship is where it's supposed to be in 5 minutes and go like that. Now the one that's in the tube there, that's a Mark 45 Astor torpedo. That had a nuclear warhead on it, and we actually didn't carry one of those. I don't really know where that one came from, but the nuclear warheads are required by Geneva Convention to have positive control on them, meaning that you have to be able to not only cut it off up to the moment of detonation, but you also have to positively set it off. So you launch that out and it won't detonate until you push the detonate button. And that's just to make sure it's doubly well secured so that we don't accidentally start nuclear war. And so the way that positive control is maintained on that torpedo is a wire connection to the ship. So it would be launched out with a giant spool of copper wire, go out about 10,000 yards, and then the wire breaks and it becomes inert, or we set it off. So that's how it would work. And interestingly enough, modern torpedoes still have wire connections today. They use, to just talk about how things change, these are gone. They don't use these on torpedoes. They use propulsor technology. It was essentially like a water jet, like a jet ski, which has much less turbulence, so you don't really see it coming and you can't hear it as much. And the wire guidance not only lets you maintain positive control, but it also lets you get data back from the torpedo, so you can, if the water temperature changes, its density will change, meaning your drag will change. So what you thought was going to be 20 knots of speed is actually like 18. So you can get data back through the wire and then make course corrections and be much more accurate. So today they're even more complicated than this. And it's because we can't just like spray and pray like you do, not to insult the Army, but you can't just like spray the field with bullets. You know, we have to be very precise because we only have, in this case, 21 shots. So we have to make each one count. So that's how that's done. And like I said, they changed a little bit over time, but the basics kind of stayed the same. It's mostly the inner workings and how they function that way. And torpedo men would be expected to keep up with the changes in doctrine and all that. So they would have trained people just dealing with these on board ship. The ship's head on board the sub is, there was 2 heads for the crew, for all 80 of the crew, well, not all 80, about 80% of them. And then we have one here in the aft torpedo room for engineering and for anybody back here really to use. And then the officers all have their own single commode as well up forward. They, just like every other warship, the officers are kept separate, so they have separate facilities and separate berthing spaces for themselves. But here, you can see it's very small, and it's just big enough for you to fit in there and do what you need to do. And there's not much room for anything else because it's not amongst the biggest of our problems that we need to worry about. So it gets lesser attention than other things. This compartment is the maneuvering room, and this is where we maneuver electricity around the ship in order to be able to provide propulsion. So USS Torsk is a diesel-electric submarine, meaning that her propellers are powered by electric motors, which receive their electricity from diesel generators. So essentially, this is like a 1944 Prius. That's kind of how it works. Like, we use our electric generators up forward, which our engines actually are nothing but power generators. So I sometimes describe it like our engine room is more like 2 rooms with 4 Kohler home generators sitting in them. So we just turn on the engines to power the generators, and that's all they do. There's no gas pedal in the traditional sense where I give it more gas to go faster or slower. All we do is from this station, I turn up the voltage or I turn down the voltage. So it's much more similar to driving an RC car than it is to driving a gas car. So when you want to make the radio controlled car go faster, you push the stick up, increase the voltage, and the car goes faster. Same thing here. So the engine rooms up forward generate the power, which comes in here, and then from this room, I distribute the power all over the ship, primarily to the propellers, but also to our battery charging and also to the ship's systems. So just behind you here is the AC switchboard. This is like the circuit breaker in your house. So I have power coming off of the generators, going into motor generators to turn it into AC current, and then powering lights and appliances and everything else we need on board ship. The big equipment that's powered by direct current is over there, so same thing, but the switch boxes are there. And then here's how I switch them around. These are bus switches, so we call them the sticks. So the sticks can send power to wherever I need it, to the motors, or like for example right here is the battery bus. I can bus that power over to the battery circuits and charge my batteries. And while we're running on the surface, remember this is primarily a surface vessel, the diesel motors are running, and when they're running, they are taking in fuel from our fuel tanks and exhausting air out through the exhaust pipes. And the only other thing they need is oxygen for combustion, which comes from right inside the boat. The air you and I are breathing right now comes into the engines through the intakes, and that's where they get their oxygen supply. So follow-up question, where's the oxygen coming from that we're breathing right now? It's coming through hatches, like the door we just walked in to come into the boat. The doors will be open. When we're up on the surface, all the hatches are open so that air can get in here and go into the engines. So when we're on the surface, everything's open, and then when we submerge, we have to close everything up. So when we submerge the ship, all the doors are closed. We have oxygen in the boat, so oxygen still can go into the engines. We still have fuel in the fuel tanks. The only thing we can't do is exhaust. So when we submerge the ship, we can't exhaust because we can't exhaust back into here or we'll all die. So if you figure out a solution to that problem, you'll make a fortune because as far as I know, nobody's ever figured out how to do it. So the only solution they come up with is instead of exhausting the engines, we just don't run the engines. So how can you run an electric motor on electricity if you can't make electricity? What do? Store the electricity. Just like we do today. All of those of you out there who think you're really super progressive for having batteries, guess what? Batteries aren't a new thing. They've been using batteries for years. And we used them on the submarine in 1944 to store electricity for use when we're submerged. So our propulsion motors, which are electric, we switch it over to battery power when we're submerged. And our batteries, just like batteries today, get you about 24 hours of use, and then that's it. And you got to spend hours and hours recharging. So I hate to tell the progressive people out there that, yes, you haven't improved anything very much. It's been doing that same thing forever. So it's not really new technology, and it's coming back now because they're trying to find ways to better store electricity. But I can tell you, at least here, we could only go about 24 hours, and then we had to go back to the surface. So
that's an important point, though, because I think there is this conception among submarines that they spent so much time under the water, but in reality, the vast majority of time was up at the surface.
Yeah, in our case, this boat mostly went down to attack or to hide. The rest of the time, we were up during the day. During the war, you could also just be up at night and then go down during the day, and you get even amount of time charging and refueling, or not refueling, but recharging the batteries and submerging. So when you're out at night, it's harder to see. So they could do things like that. But yeah, mostly you're on the surface. You're only really under in order to hide, essentially. After the war, they discovered the Germans had been working on this thing called the Type 21 U-boat, which was able to run its engines while submerged. And they were able to get away with that by using a device called a snorkel, which is exactly what you're picturing in your mind right now, with a diver with a thing sticking out of his mouth. It's essentially what it is. We just run a tube from the boat up to the surface, and that allows oxygen to come in and exhaust to go out. Seems real simple, but nobody thought of it until the end of World War II, and it was the Germans. You tend to find in military that big advances come from the side that's losing, because they're the ones that get more desperate and are more willing to try anything to win, versus the winners who are like, if it's working, don't fix it, so we'll just keep doing the same thing over and over. So yeah, the Germans came up with it, and after the war, it became a situation where here we are in Germany looking at what they've been doing, and there's us looking at this new submarine, and then over across the dockyard there's a Russian guy with his binoculars looking at the same thing. So if they've seen it, they're probably going to build it, so we better build it. So the United States started the GWII program, the Greater Underwater Propulsion Improvement Program, to try to make our submarines a little bit more advanced like that Type 21 U-boat. And one of the things, being a late boat like this, we went into war in 1944. It was relatively new, so you start with your newer boats. You don't want to convert your old stuff, just convert the new stuff. So we started and got a GWII conversion. So we got a snorkel installed, which allows us to run our engines while we're submerged, at periscope depth at least. And that was in 1952, except in 1952 something else happened in the world of submarines that was even better than that, which was nuclear power. The Nautilus went into the water, so immediately we got this fancy new conversion, then we're immediately made obsolete again by the nuclear boat. Nuclear boat doesn't require exhaust, so it can stay underwater forever. The only limiting factor on a nuclear boat is its food supply. That's the only thing it can't replenish at sea. So that's how we operated as a training ship, basically, for the rest of our service after World War II until 1968, when it was decommissioned. Now, if you look up here, the starboard side is always the senior side of the ship. And so the senior controllerman sits here, the junior controllerman is over on the port side. The control stations are basically identical, except over here I have a couple of things that he doesn't have. One of them is the sound-powered phone, so I can call anywhere on the ship and get orders or receive orders. And then there's one other device that we have on this panel that we don't have on that panel. Now this thing looks different here. Detector, they're pretty much the same. It's just that this one still has its parts. But in terms of gauges, there is one gauge on this one that doesn't exist over there. And it's right here. It's this one. ALT stands for altitude. It's an aircraft altimeter that we have on board the submarine because we have dive planes on the outside of the boat. And when you put the dive planes down and get the engines going at full speed, we can actually go out of the water and become airborne and do aerial reconnaissance. I'm kidding. I'm totally joking. I just want to see if I say it straight enough, people will believe it. No, so
I was there with you the whole time.
So the altimeter tells you your altitude, but it actually measures barometric pressure, atmospheric pressure. Right here at sea level, it's 14 pounds per square inch. So the reason that's important is because when we submerge, the inside of the boat should stay roughly 14 psi. When the snorkels are running, they're going to be pulling air from outside down the snorkel into the boat for us to breathe, and the engines are going to be sucking it up and exhausting it back out. At the top, the snorkel has a valve on top to make sure that water doesn't come down into the snorkel, so there's a little closure valve up there. If Seaman Jr. did not go up that morning and remember to oil that flap, that valve up there, and it gets stuck in the closed position when a wave goes over it, the only way we'll know about it is inside the boat here, no air will be coming in and the engines will be sucking all the air out. So slowly, your fingers will start to tingle as the air, the blood in your capillary starts to turn to gas, and your lungs start to not be able to pull anything in, and then they find a boat full of inside-out corpses. So to avoid that, we make sure that we're monitoring the pressure in here so that if the controllerman sitting here can see that pressure needle start to drop, he knows that valve is stuck in the closed position. We can cut the engines off, go to the surface, go out on deck. Seaman Jr. can go out there, oil the valve a little bit, make sure it's working. We can refill the ballast tanks with the compressed air, close all the hatches again, flood the ballast tanks so that we go down, all of which time we're visible on radar and to aircraft. So the entire mission has been compromised because that little valve got stuck, which is why we switched to nuclear power. So we don't have to deal with any of that. But it's just one of those things that you don't really think about until all of a sudden nobody can breathe in here, and then you realize it's an issue. So we have the altimeter here for that reason. coming from our generators, which are actually just below me right here, into our engine room. We have 2 engine rooms, so we have 4 total. Numbers 3 and 4 are in the aft engine room here, and numbers 1 and 2 are straight through here. They're both identical. So here's the numbers 1 and 2, Fairbanks Morse diesel engines. That's the type we use. They're actually opposed piston engines. So you're only looking at half the engine. If you look down through this hatch here, you can see the lower half. It's called the lower flats down there. So it has 2 crankshafts, one on top, one on bottom, with a cylinder in between. So we're actually getting two working machines from one diesel fuel explosion. So it just lets us be efficient. Right next to us here is the intake, so the air that's getting sucked into the engines comes right through here. And then our snorkel system actually brings air in through the ductwork over our heads. And then one other interesting thing just to point out is just behind you where you're standing at the camera there is that brass fuel oil purifier. We have to be very conscious of our ballast on board ship. And as we use fuel, the fuel, where fuel was, now has become a void. So as it empties out, the sub becomes lighter. And so they counteract that by filling the fuel tanks with seawater. Everybody who's passed second grade chemistry knows that fuel and water don't mix. So the fuel sits on top, the water sits on the bottom. Water is denser than fuel. So I believe, I don't know if it's true for diesel fuel, but they don't mix. And so we're generally okay, except that stuff that lives in the water doesn't know the rules. And so stuff might like swim out of the water and into the fuel, or just impurities in the water, like sand and salt and minerals and things. And so the purifier is a centrifuge. It spins the mixture, and all the fuel, which is light, stays in the middle, and all the heavy stuff gets spun to the outside. So in the middle, pure fuel goes down into the engines. I mentioned that the engines are nothing but giant home generators, and I can prove it to you, because when you start up your home generator at home, you don't have to drive it like you do a car. You put the, what is it, the little priming bubble, you push that a few times, and then throw the choke on, and then pull the string. And it starts up. So we have that. We have our choke switch here, so I can put it on start. And then instead of a thing to pull, it's a lever. You just push this down and get it revved up. Starts the engine up, so then we throw the choke off and put the throttle on, so we switch it to run. And then when we want to cut it off, you just throw the throttle off, cut it off. You're all qualified to operate this engine. I mean, that's pretty much it. All the rest of this stuff is making sure that there's enough fuel oil pressure and everything's working properly. I mean, for those of you who are machinist mates in the Navy, I don't mean to simplify what you do, but that's basically what there is. It's not, the point is you don't have to take speed change orders and stuff from here. We don't worry about that. They're the ones that worry about it. All we do is making sure we're producing the electricity. And then also up here we have our Kleinschmidt evaporators. Now this is an interesting device because there is so little room that we have men sleeping on top of torpedoes. We have that skinny little head that you saw. We have to refuel our fuel tanks with seawater. We don't have any room to keep fresh water with us, so we have to make it as we go along. So we use these evaporation stills to take seawater and boil it into fresh water. We can make 2,000 gallons of water a day. Almost 90% of that goes to the battery electrolytes. To replace the electrolytes in the batteries, the chemical reaction to make the electricity destroys water molecules, so we have to replace it with more. The rest of it goes to cleaning and to hydration. So by the end of the week, every submariner who served on board here had enough fresh water that he could shower for 2 minutes. That's 2 minutes per week, not per day, except for one. There is one member of the crew who gets to shower every day, and I'll let you guess who it is. It's not the captain.
Interesting.
It's the cook.
Oh.
The cook, because gross. So we're going to walk through the crew's head here, and you'll see the 2 showers that they have. The big white cabinet is for a laundry machine there. Now it's just a storage cabinet, but it was a laundry machine. Sinks, and then the commodes are just behind you here. Ooh, wrong one. That's the one. And so we'll step aside and let everybody go past us here. But
we're enjoying mooching off your tour.
so here in the cruise berthing, this room is actually called the after battery. And the reason it's called that is because the lower half of the ship, just beneath our legs, is the battery well for the after batteries. 2 batteries, the after battery and the forward battery. A battery on a submarine consists of 120 individual 4-foot tall car battery looking batteries that are all wired together in series. So 120 for a total of 240 cells that provides our electrical power. To access it, you would go through this little hatch here, and the reason the hatch is so small is because the area that I'm standing was actually filled with bunks. So there was another set of bunks right here, and the only way to get back to this space was to go right where you're standing through that little passageway there. So there'd be 36 bunks in here. So 36 members of the crew could have their bunks in here. 12 to 18 would be back in the aft torpedo room, 12 to 18 in the forward torpedo room, plus another 12 to 18 for the officers. So our crew was 80. Between all those spaces, we had enough bunks on board a fleet boat of this size for everyone to have their own, everyone to have their own rack. So hot racking is something you hear a lot about with submarines where people have to share beds. Fleet boats didn't really have to do that too much unless we were carrying extra people or we took prisoners, which this boat did in World War II. We picked up 3 prisoners, Japanese prisoners afloat in the Pacific, or something like that, where we would have 3 people sharing 2 bunks. So and it's called hot racking because it's still warm from the person who got out when you get in it. But we didn't have to do too much of that. We do have 2 kinds of bunks though. We have the coffin bunks, which are like this. They have storage in them, and they're called coffin bunks because they open like coffins. Or you have bunks like this, which are the pipe berths, the pipe bunks, which are just pipes with a hammock strung on them. And if you get one of these, if you look carefully in the outer hall here, there's a locker where you can put your stuff since you don't have a bunk for it. So if it doesn't fit in the bunk or in the locker, you can't bring it on board. Now this area will be kept at low lighting during most of the day with red lighting because people are trying to sleep in here at all hours of the day. And so when everybody else is walking through, they need to be able to see, but everybody else wants to sleep. So red lighting is very good for trying to sleep. It keeps it dark, but also there's enough light to get around. And then lastly, right here is an interesting thing you don't see on modern boats anymore. Now you're going to have to come all the way around to see this. That little gun right there, that is an ashtray. The submarine did have a smoking lamp that would go on or off through the day, depending when it was appropriate to smoke or when it was not appropriate to smoke. So if you were not a smoker, when you were serving on a submarine, you were a smoker.
How long were the men at sea typically?
So the typical mission, it could depend. Typically 72 days is kind of the standard that we use, but it's really hard to tell because a lot of submarine stuff is still classified. Because even like this boat is, for us, it's like 80 years old, but like for Iran, it's brand new. Like it's a lot of the enemies of the current United States would love to have something like this. So a lot of the information about it is still kept kind of under wraps, specific details like that. But 72 days is kind of the expected norm of what you would go out for a mission. I know during World War II, when we were doing war patrols, it was until your torpedoes ran out. So you just stayed out until you used your torpedoes, then you come back. So it just kind of depends. Nowadays, it's about 72 days. So the cruise mess is the area we are here. And this is the most open space that we have on board ship. And it not only serves as the crew's eating space, but also the recreation space, because over there, it's going to be real hard to try to do your hobbies crammed in that little thing. So in here is where you would come when you're off watch. So there'd always be somebody in here just doing whatever. It can fit 24 men at a time to eat, so 6 at each table. With a crew of 80, that means everybody gets about 10 minutes to eat, and then they got to clear out for the next rotation of people to come in, so everybody can eat around the same time. We have 4 meals a day: breakfast, lunch, dinner, and mid-rats or midnight rations. And when you're coming through here and not during mealtime, you might see we have our sister ship up in Pittsburgh, has checker and backgammon boards painted right on the tables where people can play games. Or you might see the guys who are newer to the submarine service with their books out studying. To become a submariner, you have to qualify as a submariner. And this is a volunteer branch of service. So all the services were volunteer. But when you join the Navy, normally you're expected to take on a rate and learn a skill and go do that thing. You might be a radioman or a torpedo man or a machinist mate. Today they have like cryptography and all kinds of things. And you just go into the surface fleet. But you can also volunteer to try out for submarines, which is a little bit more elite. One of the main differences with submarines compared to everywhere else is on the surface fleet, if you want to be a radioman, you learn to operate the radio. That's what you do. In the submarine, you have to learn everything. You learn everything there is about being a submariner and how all the ship systems work, plus your own job. And that's just in case you lose somebody. Everybody can do everybody's job. So it's just the training is a little more intense. It's an extra hurdle you have to get to, and so it's a little more elite. And so if you can't do it in 2 years, you go back to the surface fleet. So usually when you come through here, when the ship's at service, you'd see all the newer guys under 2 years sitting here trying to study all their material so they can qualify as submariners. And here in the museum, it's such a distinguishing thing that, like in the museum, I don't wear dolphins here as a tour guide. Like I don't pretend to wear a qualified submariner's uniform because I didn't do it. So I wouldn't deign to pretend to be something I'm not. So it's kind of an elite thing. So anyway, that's what you'd see through here. Now submarines, traditionally, I guess it's a matter of opinion, but really the tradition is that submarines get the best food in the Navy. For example, right there is a Taylor ice cream machine where they can make fresh ice cream. Other ships didn't get that until much later on, but we got it early. And the reason for that is, well, you just came through the reason for it. Otherwise, it just generally sucks to be on here
Right.
because it's so small, it's crammed. You can't smell it on the TV right now, but there's a wafty diesel smell filling the boat right here, so I'm smelling like the inside of a mower or something, which has been in here since 1968, and it will never leave. So it's all over your clothes and everything. So, and we're showering 2 minutes a week. It's a rough life. And so to compensate for that, one of the things, the perks they get is the best food. So take a look at this picture here. If you look at that picture, you'll see in that image, that is a dinner here in 1953 for the, I believe it's a birthday for this guy right here. And you've noticed their plates, it's a steak and potato dinner as opposed to the slop they're getting on the surface. And that's a coconut chocolate cake that they're getting. So just look at their uniforms. See how dirty they are? They're only washing for a very short time a week. It's the 50s, so their hair is already greasy, but it's extra greasy now because they're sweaty and nasty. You can almost smell the man smell in that picture. But look at their faces. They're all smiling, and that's the difference good food can make. And so that's why submariners get the best food. They still do today in the modern Navy. So the question is, where do we store all that food? Because we're mixing our fuel with seawater, so I doubt we're going to make a big effort on food storage, and that's a correct assessment. There is no effort. There's a little bit of a refrigerator space just beneath us here, otherwise, and some dry stores, but otherwise food is stored wherever it fits. So it could fit up here, it could fit over there, behind you. Even they go as far as piling up cans of food just right here on deck. So when you walk through here, you're walking across 2 or 3 levels of cans to get to wherever it is you need to go. And they still do that in the modern Navy. The Los Angeles class boats were doing it. And that's important to note because when you're trying to estimate the enemy's endurance, the main thing you have to worry about with a nuclear submarine is the food supply. However long the food will last. So how much food can they carry? Well, what's the volume of the boat? Because they'll fill any place that they can with food. So you really don't know what the endurance is. So
Were there systems in place to resupply submarines out at sea during World War II, or what were the logistics like with that, or did they have to go to some land-based operation?
So you could do both. They could be resupplied at sea with certain things, particularly fuel was often resupplied at sea, and then also shore-based installations. It just depends on what your patrol is and what your range is. So if you get all the way to the Sea of Japan and then you can't come all the way back to Hawaii, you'd have to find somewhere over there or have someone supply you at sea. We have a good shot of, I think it's in this video that's playing actually, where somebody was injured on board. A crew of 80 doesn't have a real high-ranking physician, like a corpsman. They might just have a pharmacist mate or something like that, so like a Band-Aid station. And there's a great shot of somebody who was seriously, I think he broke his leg, and what they do is they put him on a little dinghy raft with one other guy, and they just sit him up on the surface, on that deck up there, and they just slowly submerge the boat. So under him, and so he winds up floating in the water, and then a helicopter came and picked him up. So they could get supplied that way out at sea. So that's generally the way it would be done. You'd have to call for that. So the tricky thing is knowing where we are, because we're submerged, we're off the radar screen. The only way they know is when we report in where we are. So we have to coordinate with our radio and say, hey, we're going to be at this coordinate, and let's rendezvous, and we'll do an exchange. So that's how they could do it. So that's oh, and then the most important thing in here, most important piece of equipment, arguably on board the whole ship, is right here. Your percolator. One of the other perks of submarine service is rather than just having your coffee at chow time, this runs 24 hours a day, always running, and cups are always accessible in the scullery here. So crewmen walking to or from wherever it is they're going, they just grab a cup and get coffee whenever they want it. And then the other cool thing to point out in here is this little thing here. It kind of looks like a torpedo tube because that's basically what it is, but it's called our garbage disposal unit. and it's for exactly what you're picturing in your mind right now as I'm telling you about this. It's a torpedo tube for garbage. And the reason we do that is because if we're submerged, you can't send somebody up to the surface to dump the garbage, so it has to be ejected out. So it'll just be ejected out with compressed air from here with some weights in it, because if you let your garbage float to the surface, you're leaving a breadcrumb trail. So they just jettison out along with all the sewage. The sewage just goes right out into the water. Millions of fish crap in it every day, so 80 guys isn't really going to make a big difference. Just like, first of all, an example of when you're asking me about preservation, like here's an example, like they're just putting some fresh coats of paint down in here and just make sure that things don't corrode. It's a good example of we're just kind of trying to maintain it. We're up in the conning tower now, so this is the only part of the submarine that's actually above the rest of it. The rest of it is, I kind of describe it like a hot dog sometimes, where the middle part, the meat of the hot dog, is just kind of a cylinder where we live and work, and then the bun part on the outside is the ballast tank and the ballast system. And then there's this little bubble up top where we are, the conning tower, where we have access to our periscopes. And then just behind me here is the main helm. So this is where we're steering the ship. And from the main helm, I have my motor order telegraphs, so I communicate with the maneuver room speed change orders for how fast we want to go. We have our gyro compass repeater, rudder angle indicators, all that stuff is right here, along with the ashtray for the helmsman to use if he gets nervous. And so that's all located right here, along with our shipboard announcing system, so we can make dive orders. Just back here is pretty standard equipment you'd find on any ship's navigation bridge. We have our DRT, the Dead Reckoning Tracer, maneuvering board to help see where we are in relation to a chart or something placed over top. And then it would light up through it, and we could trace our position based on our course settings and our speeds. Just behind you there is the radar system. So for surface radar, we do keep track of the position of other ships. Behind me, or I guess beside me, is torpedo fire control. This is a good thing I like to point out to people, because in submarine movies, for Hollywood purposes, they like to show the torpedoes being fired by the lead actor down in the torpedo room, where it's really dramatic. You can't see what you're shooting at down there or when you're supposed to fire, so there's no point in doing it down there. It's actually done from here, where the commanding officer can view the periscope and know exactly when to shoot. So we would just use this. There's 6 tubes in the forward room, 4 tubes in the aft room. So you just activate which tubes you're going to want to launch from. So you launch them, you activate them, put them on standby, and then the order to fire is given, and at that point all the torpedoes are launched. So that's the fire button right here. Go ahead and deactivate those torpedo tubes so we don't.
So when they fired the torpedoes, they had like visual. They could see what they were shooting at.
Ideally you would. Yeah,
okay.
You can sort of down periscope and then go underwater and hide and get moving and hope that nobody moved too much. But yeah, generally you use your attack periscope for precise targeting, and then you'd also use this machine here. To me, it's one of the coolest things on here. It's an analog computer, a calculation computer that uses nothing but gears and little rotating dials to make calculations. So here's my periscope. The commanding officer, the officer of the watch, is going to be here looking through the periscope, looking at his range indicators, and as you can see, I can move the range to see what I'm seeing. And then just behind me, where the camera is where our data controller would be. So he would see the measurements that I'm taking, and he'd plug them in to the torpedo data computer here, and you just put the right numbers in, and you can see it kind of does all the trigonometry for you through this really complex and in my opinion, amazing machine.
Yeah.
And spits out the calculations that you would program into the torpedo gyro compasses so they know where they're supposed to go. So it's all trigonometry and math. So kids who are interested in why you have to sit in your trigonometry class, this is why. So you don't have to deal with all this. You can just do it in your mind, and they have trained to do that. Like, they do angle of attack and approach, and that's what's all used for. I wondered when I was in school, like, why do we have to learn all this stuff? It comes in handy now. I wish I had paid attention more, because now I could explain this better. But anyway, that's how all this works. So this is where the commanding officer would be stationed, and he would be commanding the ship basically from here. All the command stuff is all up here. We do have some redundant stuff down below. And then to get onto the bridge, you could come through here, and that's pretty self-explanatory. They just go up to the flying bridge this way, and what's really more interesting is how they come down, because people that are on bridge watch might also be working in the control room here. And so if you have to go the furthest away, like the furthest one in, you have to come down first. So you can go in, and then the person who's closer goes down next. So they come down in a particular order and all file into their stations and work that way. So it's kind of complex, but it's one thing you practice it over and over again. This ship was a dive trainer. They did diving drills constantly on here for stuff like that, so that when the time comes, you don't have to think about it. Your body just knows how to do it. So this area is not something you normally get to see on board USS Torsk when you come to visit as a public visitor, unless I happen to be here and I can let you up. But we do run some special tours this summer where you can come up, and if you're here at a certain time, at usually 2 o'clock, we run these, and you can come up and see the conning tower. All right, so Josh, this is the control room. This is where we control the angle and speed of the dive. And I'm actually standing in the forward part of the compartment. The dive officer would actually be standing right here. And right next to his station is where the alarm panels are, which are those colored dials up there, which each have a different handle. So if we lose power, you can tell by feel which one you're pulling. We also have the 1MC snorkel controls there, and then he has the bathythermograph view screen, which is here, which tells you water temperature, which temperature can indicate density and a couple of other things, and sonar acts different in different densities of water, and our buoyancy would be different, so you need to maintain tabs on that. And as we go around the horn, over here are our 2 dive plane controls. So we have a set of dive planes forward. They're little wings that stick off the bow, and we have a set aft that stick off the stern, and they help to point and angle the bow up or down, so that when we move with our forward propulsion through the water, we're going to go like this. Rather than trying to use our ballast tanks to go up and down, we can use the dive planes to just angle the bow down, and then our forward propulsion will push us down. So it's kind of like a penguin or a fish moving through the water like that. So that way, because once you leave the surface, you can't get any more compressed air. That's all we're going to have. So if you use it all just joyriding up and down, you're going to run out. So that's how we go up and down. Common question people ask us is, how deep could Torsk go? The answer is, I don't know. A lot of that information is still kept classified. And so some of the reports I haven't seen, I don't really know how deep it could go. So I have to use my observational archaeology, which if you take a look above those dive plane wheels, there are big shallow depth gauges. Those are the big wheels with all the numbers on them. You can see they go from 0 to 165 feet, which tells you that this submarine mostly operated within that window of 0 to 165 feet deep. If you look in the middle, there's a brass ring that has the deep depth gauge in it, and that goes to 600 feet. So I know that this boat at least was presumed to be able to go to 600 feet. It could probably do more than that, but I don't know how much more than that, and I do know that the amount is finite. There is a point where it hits crutch depth and the boat just implodes and becomes crumbs. So, but I don't know what that is, so I say 600 feet.
Have there been written records from any of the men who served on submarines like this that have talked about those types of details, or?
Yeah, we get, this boat was around in the 60s, so there's people that served on it that are not that old, and some of them are part of our volunteer crew, and so we get anecdotal evidence that way. I actually put a post up not too long ago about where a test depth was when I was corrected by a crew member. He told us the test depth was 400 feet, so Greg Cotton, if you're watching, I'm saying 400 feet now. So 400 foot was the test depth, which is kind of where they would test all the systems and make sure everything was stable. And then they kind of assumed that, and they still do today, you can exceed your test depth by double, generally. Is like, it's kind of expected that you can do it if you need to. But it is finite, and you do have to be careful. So otherwise, we do get anecdotal evidence. Like when I was on here, we did this much. But I give 600 feet because, like, yeah, that's a cool story. What did you have for breakfast this morning? Oh, you don't remember? Well, then forgive me, I'm not taking your word for it. So it's one of those things where, like, as a historian, I try to be as provable as possible.
Sure.
So I can prove it by pointing to that depth gauge. But it doesn't mean the lore's not fun, and I can't tell you that, oh, well, so-and-so told me they could go this much or whatever. So, yeah, so he said the test depth was 400. You could probably do 800, but you don't want to do that too much. So just forward of that is our forward port station. So here is where we control the openings to let ballast out or in. So we let the air leave and water to come in, or we close the valves to pump the air in and push the water out. That's all done with hydraulic manifolds here. And then just above it, we have the Christmas tree. It's the hull opening indicator panel. So that indicates openings in the hull. We call it Christmas tree because that's a lot easier to say. And the red and green lights kind of give it a Christmassy feeling. So that's where that comes from. If the light is green, that means that the door is closed and no seawater can get in here. If there's a red one, that means something is open, and if you dive this boat, someone dies. So we make sure that the board is green before they signal to actually submerge the boat. So that's how we keep track of all the doors and openings that we have. So green board, then the order is given to dive. The klaxon is actually right there in my ear, so now I'm deaf.
Very effective.
And then here is an auxiliary helm station. So it's a duplicate of the helm up in the conning tower. The conning tower is a separate bubble, so if something happens and that were to flood, we could isolate it and then still control the ship from down here. So it's just another example of redundancies you build in. So you got your gyro compass repeater, motor telegraphs, rudder angle indicators. The main gyro compass is under here in the main center. And then there's our switchboard to power everything in here. So that's how we distribute all the power. And then lastly, to come back up, the hammer valves there release the compressed air systems that we have. We have various compressed air systems for various tasks ranging between 10 psi and 3000 psi. And those valves are special, so you actually have to hammer them open and hammer them closed to make sure they're nice and tight. So when they want to surface, they would blow ballast, blow the compressed air, and push the seawater out, making us more buoyant, and then we go up to the surface. So normally what you would do is you would use your propeller and your dive planes to get as close to the surface as you can. You'd use your propulsions to get us up out of the water, and then you use your ballast to just pop yourself up above the surface so you're actually floating again. So that's how you do it. All right, so we're now entering officer's country, which is the most luxurious part of the ship, although looking at it, you might not believe me because it's so skinny, but that's just so we have a little passage to get through. So if you follow me down, we'll take you through. First off, right here is our yeoman's office. So the yeoman is the ship's secretary. He's the one doing liberty passes and qualification certificates and general correspondence that comes in from communications. It all gets typed up and reports are all done in here. So he gets his little dinky closet that he gets to work in. And then moving aft, the first people we see here in the wardroom are the chief petty officers. So chief petty officers are always isolated from the rest of the enlisted crew, although they themselves are also enlisted. They all berth together, like rates with like rates. So in here is where our chiefs go, just somewhat separated from the rest of the crew. And then, of course, starboard side is the senior side. So over here on the starboard side, we have the commanding officer's stateroom. And I say commanding officer's stateroom because a captain is a naval rank, which is usually commands more men than a submarine has. So submarines are usually commanded by a commander, a person with the rank of commander. Sometimes you get a captain in here, but usually it's a commander or lieutenant commander. So, but the master of any ship is called the captain, so it's the captain's stateroom. And then over here on the port side are the officers' staterooms. So the XO engineering officer, and then I think maybe the operations officer. Don't quote me on that, but those are usually kind of the top three guys on a modern ship. They would all berth in here, so they're the senior officers, and then all your lieutenants, or Lieutenant JGs, would be in Boys Town here. They're the junior officers, so they sleep in Boys Town, which is right across from the wardroom, where you're peeking in right now. This is where all the officers would take their meals and hang out when they're off watch, because on a Navy ship, officers do not fraternize with the enlisted men. They keep that separation between authority, and so they have their own special place here. And you're passing Boys Town, which is right there. So that's where our junior officers would bunk, and everybody gets a couple of drawers in the dresser and shares the desk. And then interestingly enough, the last thing I like to point out here is we've had men sleeping on top of torpedoes back there. We're showering 2 minutes a week, walking on top of our canned food because there is no room on this boat for anything, but officers are traditionally served by a steward. So some traditions are just too important for the Navy to give up. So even though we have all those restrictions on everybody else, the officers still have a pantry here just for their steward to prepare their meals, because, you know, you just can't sacrifice some things. And then the last thing up forward here is the officer's head, where the officers would use the restroom, separated from everyone else. And we're now in the forward torpedo room, which contains the sonar shack, where we have our active and passive sonar. Passive sonar is essentially just a microphone sticking out in the water and we're listening for things. Active sonar is the ping that you send out and get a response back, or a bounce back, to measure distance or speed of a closing object. The forward torpedo room is basically the exact same as the aft torpedo room, except we have 6 tubes up here instead of just 4, but everything works exactly the same way. They're loaded through the hatch, come in, sit on the sleds, and to actually get them out into the tubes, we have to use one of the most complicated and advanced machines on board the ship. It's self-repairing, biomechanical, and it runs off of food. Me. We use manpower to just pull this basic, simple block and tackle system that you'd find on any wooden sailing ship to move this 1 ton or 1.5 ton torpedo from here into the tube. So as I said in the earlier part of the tour, torpedoes are not bullets. You don't fire one and then reload by changing out your magazine. It takes up to 5-10 minutes to reload the tubes fully to be ready for another round of ordnance. So what happens is the torpedo tube leaves the tube. The tube is then flooded with seawater because the door's open. We want that because each of these torpedoes weighs 2,000 pounds or so, so you launch 3 of them. We just lost 6,000 pounds off the bow, which means the whole boat now wants to float from the bow. So having the seawater fill in kind of equalizes that buoyancy so we don't suddenly go to the surface. But before we can open this door, we gotta close the front door and then get all the water out. So the water is drained into a trim tank and then it's slowly pumped overboard so we can adjust the trim of the boat and compensate for it. Then once the tube is empty, then we can open the back door and reload. So it's not like, oh, you missed, reload and fire again. No, it's you missed, run away. Because we only really get 1 shot before we're toast. So that's how that works. We have an original Mark 14 from Torsk right here. And then up top here is a Mark 37. Mark 14 again runs off of Everclear, 200 proof ethanol. And then this one is an electrical. And got your bunks as well. So the other thing we have up here in the forward end is the escape trunk, which allows 4 men to evacuate the vessel every 30 minutes. So again, unless we're sinking hilariously slowly in very shallow water, pretty much everybody goes down with the boat. So this is here so you feel better, but it doesn't actually save anybody. Plus, once you get down to a certain depth, if you open that door, it's just going to be millions of pounds of pressure crushing you. So it won't help you anyway. Not to put a damper on it, but that's the reality of it.
No,
So,
I mean, that takes us back to what you mentioned at the very beginning when you were talking about just the number of deaths in the submarine force during World War II and how risky basically it was serving on these.
Yeah, they basically always lost with all hands. So just because it's impossible to get you, I mean, they operate in depths of thousands and thousands of feet, so there's nothing you can do. Yeah, when submarines go down, they implode. So it's, if you picture an explosion, but in reverse, they explode inwards. So it's as quick and as fast, but just inwards. So you just disintegrate inwards. So the good news is it's so fast you don't really know it happened. So they usually just find wreckage, just like it blew up, but just on the bottom. So it takes a certain kind of person to do this kind of work and to work in this kind of environment. So that's why nobody's forced to do it. It's people that want to do it and can handle it that can do it, which is why we think it's so admirable, and we keep the museum up like this to honor it. So.
Yeah, it's always incredible to walk through a submarine like this because, I mean, you get to experience how tight those spaces were, like you've talked about, the proximity of sleeping on top of a torpedo and just those types of scenarios that was everyday life for these guys.
Yeah. I've slept in this one myself. We do overnight programs on board the submarine, and we had too many people to fill the bunk room, so the staff had to jump up in here. It's comfy. Once you're asleep, you don't notice. It's just getting up and remembering that you got a 6-foot drop here. But yeah, you get used to it. I'm sure the men back then would just get used to it, and it seemed nice. What's real refreshing is when we go up top here and we go out back outside, and you can smell non-diesel smell again. That's when you remember. But yeah, it's so good. The other interesting thing I point out is you're on board USS Torsk right now. People often ask me about the name of the ship. Fleet boats were named after sea creatures. So the Torsk is actually a North Atlantic cod. Basically, it's a North Atlantic game fish. There already was a USS Cod that is also a museum ship. I forget where. I want to say it's up on the Great Lakes. So they couldn't name another one cod, so they took the Norwegian term for North Atlantic cod. It's a Norwegian game fish. And USS Torsk, that's where we got our name from. Even the Nautilus, the first nuclear boat, Nautilus is a shellfish. So they were just naming them after sea creatures. Now they're named after cities and states usually, and I think now they're doing famous Americans for the new classes. So yeah, there's always a naming scheme of some kind. So yep, USS Torsk, you got on the USS, essentially North Atlantic codfish today.
There we
That's
go.
the name of the ship.
So we're back on top of the submarine now. This has been a fantastic tour. If people want to come visit the submarine, where can they find you online, and where's some information about how all that works?
Sure, so we're online at www.historicships.org, and then we also have a Facebook page where we put on updates for things that are going on board, that updates to the restoration and special events and things like that. And then, yeah, just right down here in Baltimore's Inner Harbor, you get all 4 ships in the fleet as part of your ticket, and we welcome everybody to take part in our tours, our overnight programs. We do all kinds of experiences that you can have on board. So,
yeah, that's what makes it so cool, is it's not just one vessel, but you've got a variety of eras and different types of ships here, and so it really makes for a really fun trip if you come check all these out. So thank you.
You're welcome.